the scrape of a trowel against grey tarmac. A Leicester car park in 2012. An ordinary sound, in an ordinary place. But then, a silence falls over the small team of archaeologists, a quiet so profound it seems to swallow the distant city noise. They are looking at a skeleton, carefully uncovered beneath the asphalt. And they know, with a certainty that feels almost sacred, that they are not looking at an ordinary man. To understand the king beneath the tarmac, we must go back 5 centuries to the final desperate charge of the last Plantagenet king, Richard III. The world Richard knew was one of stone and shadow. His true home was not the pomp of London, but the draughty halls of Middleham Castle in the north. Here, life was measured by the crackle of a great fire in the hearth and the slow, steady drip of melting beeswax candles. He was a man of the north, governing justly, far from the glittering, treacherous court of his brother, Edward IV. But in the spring of 1483, a messenger brought word that shattered that quiet existence. Edward was dead. The political vacuum left behind was immediate and dangerous. The young king, Edward V, was only 12, and his mother's family, the Woodvilles, moved swiftly to secure power. To Richard, watching from the north, this wasn't just a power grab. It was a threat to the very stability of the realm his brother had built. The Woodvilles had been Lancastrians, old enemies. The Croyland Chronicle, a vital source from the time, would later describe Richard as being persuaded to take the protectorship, perhaps even unwilling to prevent the kingdom from falling into the hands of his brother's adversaries. The weight of that decision would have been felt in the cold, seeping through the stone walls of his chambers. It was a burden, not an ambition. He rode south not to seize a crown, but to secure a crown for his nephew. But in London, he found not a grateful court, but a nest of suspicion. The old nobility, men like Lord Hastings, shared his fears of Woodville dominance. What began as a mission of protection quickly spiraled into a coup. Hastings, his ally, was summarily executed. The young king and his younger brother were placed in the Tower of London, not as prisoners, but for their own safekeeping, a customary practice for monarchs awaiting coronation. The coronation that followed in July 1483 was that of Richard III. The crown of England, placed upon Richard's head in Westminster Abbey, was cold and heavy. The cheers of the crowd were perhaps muffled by the doubt in his own heart. He had taken the throne to prevent a war, arguing that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, rendering the young princes illegitimate. In doing so, he had made himself a usurper. The Croyland chronicler observed the event with a sense of foreboding, noting the sedition and disgraceful nature of the proceedings. The reluctant protector was now a king, and a shadow of his own making had begun to fall across his reign. That shadow took the form of 2 boys, the princes in the Tower. As the summer of 1483 wore on, they were seen less and less often, playing in the garden within the fortress walls. Then, they were seen no more. The whispers began first in the palace corridors, then spread through the city and across the kingdom. Doubt about their actual fate became the defining mystery of Richard's reign. The Italian historian Polydore Virgil, writing later for the Tudor dynasty, would firmly lay the blame at Richard's door, but even he could only report what was whispered. The burden of kingship now became immense. Every act of governance, every effort to rule justly and effectively was now viewed through the lens of that lingering suspicion. An Act of Parliament, the Titulus Regius, was passed to secure his legitimacy, but legal documents could not silence the gossip that echoed in the great halls. The personal cost was immense. His wife, Queen Anne began to decline within the stifling atmosphere of a court haunted by unspoken questions. The very air grew thick with unease. Yet Richard tried to be a good king. He introduced legal reforms aimed at helping the poor, declaring that suspects should be allowed bail and that forced loans, known as benevolences, were illegal. He presided over his court with a sharp mind, settling disputes and administering justice. But the shadow would not lift. Then, in April 1484, tragedy struck a personal blow. His only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, the boy who had grown up in those northern halls Richard loved, died after a short illness. The chroniclers wrote that the king and queen were left in a state bordering on madness from their sudden grief. The heir to the throne was gone. The dynasty he had sought to protect was crumbling. As whispers grew louder, his enemies began to gather. In the courts of Europe, a forgotten figure began to seem like a plausible alternative. Henry Tudor, a distant claimant with a thin strand of Lancastrian blood, began to gather support, promising to marry the prince's elder sister, Elizabeth of York, and unite the warring factions. The very existence of this new threat was a testament to the instability Richard's actions had created. He had taken the crown to prevent chaos, but chaos was now knitting itself together against him, drawing strength from the silent rooms in the tower and the unanswered questions that hung in the air like a cold mist. In the damp dawn light of August 22nd, 1485, near Market Bosworth, Richard awoke from a troubled sleep. The air was thick with morning mist, obscuring the lines of the enemy army gathering across the field. He had seen horrible images in his dreams, but now reality offered its own grim tableau. He would, he declared, make an end either of war or of life. He chose to wear his crown into battle. The fight began with the thunder of cannon and the hiss of arrows. But as the battle raged, Richard saw his moment. Spotting Henry Tudor's standard across the field, he made a desperate, furious charge with his closest knights, cutting his way toward his rival. It was an act of immense courage, but as he fought, he was overwhelmed. The Stanley family, whose loyalty he had counted on, betrayed him. Turning the tide, the Crowland chronicler recorded his manful end in the thick press of battle. The last Plantagenet King died on a muddy field, his battered crown tumbling from his helm, his body left to the victors. His body was lost to history, its burial place in Leicester fading into legend, until centuries later, a car park gave up its secret. The archaeological silence of that dig in 2012 was broken by the careful brushing away of centuries. Science then took over. The skeleton revealed severe scoliosis, a curved spine that would have given him a distinctive posture, but not the hunchback of Shakespearean myth. The reconstructed face that emerged was not a monster's, but a man's young, thoughtful, even handsome. It was a dignified rebuttal to Tudor propaganda, found not in parchment, but in bone and DNA. In 2015, Richard III was laid to rest again, with honor in Leicester Cathedral. A king had finally come home. Richard's story is one of a complex man slowly emerging from the long shadow of his enemies. His rediscovery reminds us that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is whispered by the earth itself. If you found a sense of peace in this quiet corner of history, consider subscribing for more stories where the past whispers its secrets.